I am recording. And are you seeing my PowerPoint or are you seeing something else?
I'm seeing a go live on Facebook message.
Oh, great. All right, give me 1 second. Now it won't let me get to the tab I want. There we go. Okay, welcome, welcome. This is our Wednesday webinar series from Latter-day Saint Home Educators. LDSHE is an all-volunteer nonprofit with a mission to support, strengthen, and inspire Latter-day Saint families in home education. We're putting on conferences that gather hundreds of Latter-day Saint homeschoolers from across the country since 2004. Today's presentation was supposed to be live at one of our conferences, but due to Corona concerns, we are just doing our webinars this year. We're embracing our theme of trust the journey and moving forward. We hope that you'll find motivation, inspiration, and encouragement in today's presentation. We have a couple housekeeping things before we get started. If you have any questions for the presenters, go ahead and type those in the Q&A or the chat section. And at the end of theirs, I will go ahead and read those questions and they can answer those for you. We'd like to remind you that replays of these webinars are available on Latter-day Saint Home Educators Facebook page and on our YouTube channel and website, LDSHE.org, by the Friday after this airs. This will be happening every Wednesday until May 20th at 11 a.m. and 6 p.m. Eastern. Again, we welcome you to this. We're going to start by turning the time over to Dana Wood for dyslexia, and then after her Q&A, we'll go to Tiffany Salter, and we'll be talking about dysgraphia. So if you will hang on for that. Dana, it's all you.
All right. Okay, so my name is Dana Wood. I have been homeschooling for 34 years. I have 10 children. I have graduated 9 of my 10 children, and I have 4.5 more years to go before my last one is done. My children have suffered from, that's an awkward word. 8 of my 10 children have had some form of dyslexia. I also have dyslexia, and that's one reason why I homeschool, is because I didn't like the way that the public school handled dealing with dyslexia. It certainly did not help me. And when I saw that my oldest son was definitely dyslexic, even as a preschooler, I could tell that he was. And so I made the decision to homeschool, and I haven't looked back since. But today we're going to talk about dyslexia, what it is, how you can help your child. And I'll be talking about reading in particular, and then Tiffany will be talking about dysgraphia and dyscalculia, which are other forms of dyslexia. Some of my children had dyslexia had it pretty severe, and others of it had varying degrees of dysgraphia, and some of them had all of them together. And so it is it's something that I know very well, and so hopefully my tips will be able to help you figure out how to help your child. So let's get into my PowerPoint, and let's see. So what is dyslexia? A lot of people think that dyslexia is actually brain damage And that's why it's classified as a learning disability, but that's not the case. It's not a brain problem, but it's actually a language processing problem. And it can affect speech as well as reading, spelling, math, and handwriting. And the way that it affects speech isn't necessarily that your child will have a speech impediment, but it will mean that they have a difficult time getting what they have in their head out into speech. And it also can cause them to end sentences abruptly, thinking that they have completed a thought when they didn't. And it can also mean that they get very, very frustrated when they're trying to explain something to you and they just cannot get the words out and you just are not understanding them. New research shows that dyslexics who are taught to read and calculate using their strengths use their right brains, not their left. In order for them to do that, though, since it's not the natural way of things, they have to learn how to build those pathways. And the things that I'm going to teach you today will help you build those pathways. And we'll go more into that in just a minute. Dyslexics mix up the symbols of reading and math and handwriting in the process of understanding those symbols. It's not an eye problem, but it is a processing problem between what they see and what the brain does with that information. That's why if everything looked the same every time, then they would not have a reading problem. But it changes. It changes every time they look or write that word. It appears differently to them, and so that can really contribute to frustration, because to them it looks the same and they can't understand why they're not understanding it. This is how most of us read. So this is something that's according to research at Cambridge University. It doesn't matter in what order the letters are in a word are. The only important thing is that the first and last letters be at the right place. The rest can be a total mess and you can still read it without problem. This is because the human mind does not read every letter by itself, but the word as a whole. So this is how we read, and this is how we can increase our reading, because we are not decoding every single word as it comes at us. We are anticipating what that word says, and 99 times out of 10, it's correct, and that's how we're able to read fluently. This is what a dyslexic might see. To a dyslexic, this looks like the cat jumped up on the bed. But this time that they're reading the sentence, all the E's are changed to A's and all the A's are changed to E's. And they cannot see that difference. So it can be very frustrating to them to try and understand, because they think that they're reading it correctly and it's just, their brain is just not processing it correctly. So how do I know if my child is dyslexic? If your child is bright and highly intelligent and articulate, but unable to read, write, or spell at grade level, they're probably dyslexic. Labeled lazy, dumb, careless, immature, they're not trying hard enough. I know when I was in school, the first grade teacher that I had actually told my mother to spank me whenever I didn't do my homework, because obviously I was smart enough to be able to do it. But I'm sorry, I could not read it. They're very talented in art and drama, and they understand things very clearly. Music is important to them, but at the same time, they cannot read at grade level. I need to share my screen again. Okay. Okay. Let me see what is the problem here. Is it showing now? Okay. Let me go back.
It's not showing yet, Dana.
Okay. Let's see. Go back over here. Share screen again. Is it working now?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so did you guys see the examples that I used for reading?
No, we haven't seen any yet.
Okay, so let's go back to this one.
And then if you hit presenter, then it'll just show us the big one.
Okay. Can
There
see
you
it?
go.
Okay.
Yep, that's perfect.
Okay, so now that you understand what I'm talking about, as you read this screen, you can see that the letters are all scrambled up. And it says, according to a research at Cambridge University, it doesn't matter in what order the letters in a word are. The only important thing is that the first and last letter be in the right place. The rest can be a total mess, and you can still read it without problem. This is because the human mind does not read every letter by itself, but the word as a whole. Okay, so. But this is how a dyslexic might see a sentence. This, to a dyslexic, would read gibberish, but to us, it should read, the cat jumped up on the bed. See, I'm dyslexic and I have a hard time reading that. But in this case, the A and the C have swapped places. And so every place that there's an A, there's a C, and an E, and every place that there's an E, there's an A. And to the dyslexic, they cannot understand that those things have switched, because to them it looks normal. But if they were to write a sentence like this, we would be very frustrated with them, saying, I don't understand. You should be able to write this. But this is how it works for them. And this is because the brain patterns in their brain are not connecting properly. And through learning to read in a different manner, they will be able to be able to build those pathways, and it will be able to help them not have problems with that as frequently. And some, they can actually reverse it. Okay, so how do I know if my child is dyslexic? Okay, let's go on to confused by letters and numbers in sequence. If they go to spell something, they cannot spell it, especially if they haven't written it down. If you give them a series of numbers, they can't repeat them back to you. If you give them a bunch of words in a sequence, they can't keep them in order. Sometimes dyslexics feel that words are moving around on a page. Like for me, if I'm not tracking properly, I will pick up letters from the row behind me, down from me, and I will connect them with the words that are up for me, especially if I'm tired and And now as I'm an adult and I know how to read, I'll know that that's a mistake. But for a child that's just beginning to read, they cannot see that. It just is a frustrating thing that words don't stay still. They cannot spell consistently because they don't process it consistently. They can often be ambidextrous, and they often confuse left and right because they have no orientation reference. They can't understand the passage of time, and they will freak out if they're expected to use a timer to time themselves because they don't understand the passage of time. And so where someone who understands the passage of time will be able to pace themselves with a timer, they can't, because they can't tell how much time has passed. Mistakes and symptoms increase dramatically if they're confused, if they're under time pressure, under emotional stress, or they feel like expectations are too high. Then they have a very difficult time, and that makes it much, much worse for them in their reading. There are two types of dyslexia. There's dysgraphia and dyscalculia as well, but these are the two types of reading dyslexia. There's dysphonetic, which is the inability to connect sounds to symbols. So if they were to write the word phonics, they would spell it Phonics instead of with the PH. They have a tendency to spell words phonetically, and our language isn't written phonetically. There's too many words that are exceptions to the rule. So it can become very frustrating for them to figure out why the words that they think are spelled correctly are not spelled correctly, and the words that are spelled correctly don't make sense. And then there's the dyslexic, and they have trouble reading whole words, mostly because the letters move around, and until they become fluent, that becomes a real problem because as we saw with the example I gave you, they try and pronounce what they see, and that is not always correct. But dyslexia is not just a problem in learning to read. It also has a lot of positives to it because because the brain is different. It has different aspects to it that it's a very right brain, and so it's these are some of the talents that they have. They have the ability to utilize their brains in order to alter and create perceptions. They're able to make connections between things that the average person doesn't see. They're highly aware of the environment that they're in. This can actually be a problem. The way that it's a positive is that they can read the room and they know what everything is that is going on. They understand how everybody's feeling. They're highly intuitive to the interactions of everybody in the room. They're also aware of every sound, every pencil, every window, everything that's going on in that room. This can be a detriment to them when they're trying to concentrate and they're highly distracted by everything that's going on. So they really need quiet space when they're working on something that is a challenge to them. They're more curious than average, and so they have this drive to continue to learn about something and will chase rabbit holes for forever, rabbit trails for forever to be able to find out the things that they're curious about. They think mainly in pictures rather than words. That means that they can process things much, much faster than someone who doesn't, because they don't have to process it into language or words and then back. And so they can flip through thoughts and premises and events so fast because they see it as a picture. Imagine thumbing through a bunch of photographs and how quickly you can sort through them because everyone triggers another thought or memory. So they're able to move much more quickly. At the same time, when they go to discuss something with you, they see it in a picture, and if they can't express it in words, they can get very frustrated because they're trying to describe something that is difficult to describe in words, but is very clear in their head. They're highly intuitive and very insightful. So they're very able to take a problem and wrestle with it and be able to figure out solutions and figure them out really fast. The problem with that can be that they figure them out so fast that they can't remember how they did it. So when they come to doing math, they can't explain how they got the answer. They just know they got the right answer. They think and perceive multidimensionally. They use all their senses. So think of looking at a problem with a helicopter view. And you're in a helicopter and you're going all the way around this object and you're experiencing everything that is possible to experience it because it's a picture. And so that allows them to be able to, again, to problem solve and to be able to think through experiences and be able to really see things clearly and see the big picture that that most people wouldn't be able to see. They can experience thoughts as reality. So that means that something that they're just thinking about in their head, they think about it in such great detail that they can recreate it in reality. So that makes them innovators. It makes them great artists. It makes them able to take materials and create something because what goes on in their heads is so clear to them that they're able to clearly recreate it. They have vivid imaginations. Sometimes that can be a good thing because they live in a world that is just amazing with all these ideas that they can come up with and stories that they can tell. The problem is when they get in trouble, they can really come up with some whoppers because they are so creative. So the bottom line is that people with dyslexia tend to have a higher than normal intelligence and extraordinary creative capabilities. In other words, most dyslexics are gifted, and most dyslexics are not treated as if they're dyslexic. They're treated as if they're broken. Okay, so teaching dyslexics to read means, that you build on their strengths, not their weaknesses. So the things that we just listed as their strengths, that's the type of thing that you use to teach them with. They will never learn to read by being taught with left brain, typical reading programs. There's a new study that has come out in the last year or so where they took students who were they were diagnosed in kindergarten, and they followed them all through their schooling until they were adults. And then they tested them. They did brain scans on them to see how their brains were the same or different. And they found that those who used left brain training methods, which is what is typically taught in public school, they never learned to read. And they never learned to read because their brain was never able to make the connections in their brain to allow them to be able to overcome the challenges. Those who were taught in the methods like I'm going to show you tonight, their brains actually rewired, and they have brains where the pathways for reading are on the right side of the brain and not the left brain like typical people have. And they were able to rewire those in the part of the brain that they use most, which is the right brain. And by being able to do that, they were able to overcome their challenges and were actually able to read fluently. And most, you couldn't tell the difference between those who had been diagnosed in kindergarten and the average reader of their age. The most damaging thing that you can do as a teacher is to treat them like they're damaged. They're not damaged. They are creative geniuses who have a challenge reading. So let's teach them how to read in a way that benefits them. Okay, so what are their specific strengths that we're going to play to? They're good at seeing patterns. They love to see relationships between ideas, and when you introduce them to those relationships and help them see them, they remember them. It's like a photographic memory. They will, once they tie ideas together, they never forget them. They don't need rote memorization to have them memorized once they see the connections. They also have a superb sense of rhythm, and that sounds weird that they would have this thing, but once they get the rhythm of reading, then they can play to that strength and add it to the other strengths to be able to learn fluency in reading. But they are poor at rote memorization, and that is the method that most reading programs use in order to teach reading. Okay, there's 4 stages to learning to read. There's beginning letters and sounds. There's decoding, which is where you string letters and sounds together to create words. And then fluency is going from decoding something where you're constantly saying the separate sounds of each letter into being able to see the word as a whole. And that is what increases fluency. And then fluency increases as you gain fluency. That increases not only your speed of reading, but also your comprehension. Most people who don't have reading problems do the decoding, the fluency, and the comprehension pretty much together, and most people can't tell when they started one and blended into the other. But a lot of people get stuck on the decoding into fluency stage, and they never learn to read quickly because of that. And dyslexics, if they're not taught to read whole words, they will never get past that decoding stage. And since everything's flipping around as they read, they are very poor readers. So what we need to do is to be able to make the decoding easier, and then allow the decoding to lead to fluency. And we have some tricks that we can use to help build that fluency. And as they're learning their fluency, they'll also need to be working on their comprehension. But if you can't decode a word, you cannot understand what you're reading. And so those three really go together and are really tied together. And we'll talk about how to use those. So beginning readers, you're going to be teaching the sounds. In a normal phonics program, you would teach them the letter, and you would teach them the sounds, and then you would teach the short sound, and then 3-letter words, and then 4-letter words, and you would build on what you're doing. So you're taking little bits and pieces of reading, and you are breaking it down into its littlest parts, and then adding them together like a puzzle, and then eventually you'll see the big picture. With dyslexics, they have to see the big picture. If they don't see the big picture and the why of what you're teaching them, they have no way of connecting those thoughts together, and they make no sense. But if you teach the letters and sounds, and you do it with clay letters and have them create those letters, then they have a visual picture in their mind of what those letters look like, what the sound, they can tie the sounds to those pictures, and they can build words with those clay letters, and they have pictures in their head of what those words should look like. So when they see them on the written page, then they are able to, because they see in pictures, they're able to say, oh, well, that's that word. Oh, that's that word. And they can gather them together and the sounds and letters, and they make much more sense. You also need to teach word patterns, because they always are looking for patterns. And if you can teach them to look at a word and see, what do you know about this word? Have you ever seen a word that looks like this before? Then they can see the patterns, and each word is not a mystery, but they can look at it and say, oh, well, that ends in at, just like bat and cat does. And so you're teaching word families as rhymes, not as, okay, these are all the words you need to memorize that end in AT. Instead, you're going to say, these are the sounds that AT make, and they go together with, so let's go down this list. And so as you use their rhythm and their sounds as they're reading that whole list together, well, these are all the word family. These are all the words in the word family for at, bat, cat, hat. And you go through the list, and instead of having to look at the individual letters of each of these words, they're looking at the whole word and recognizing the patterns within that word, so that the next time they see it, they'll see that pattern and go, I know this, and they'll be able to read the word. You're going to teach the relationships between words instead of rote mastery. Just like I said, you're going to be able to see the patterns, and when they see those relationships between words, then it's not guesswork anymore, and they don't have to decode it. They know it, and they can look at the pictures in their head and go, oh, I have seen this before. And like I said, use clay letters to help them be able to find the pictures in their mind. Okay, dyslexics see in pictures, and they can look at something and remember it with photographic memory if they paid attention to the details. But a lot of times they don't have that skill, and that's something that we can teach them. So they see in a big picture, but they'll miss all the fuzzy little details. And so playing games that are memorization games, such as I Spy, concentration, setting things out on a tray, and then you they close their eyes and you take one and they have to tell you which one you took. That is paying attention to detail. As they learn that skill, that will increase their reading, because they will learn to pay attention to their reading and be able to pay attention to the connections between word families, and be able to see the difference between at and ball. And so as they do that, as they learn those memories, concentration and detail skills, then it will help them in, well, it will help them with their reading. So memorizing poems, quotes, and scriptures, this also gives them lots of practice with words, and they have to be able to pay attention to those words in order to memorize them. And so when they see those same words that they've memorized in reading, it will help them to remember, because they already have pictures of those words in their mind. Have them gather words and words and words. Instead of doing flashcards where you do where, okay, here's the stack of flashcards, you're going to read off all these words to me. What you're going to do is say, let's build flashcards with words you want to know. And it doesn't matter whether they are on their reading list or not. They're going to be able to pick these words up because they want to. And so if you have words that go with their hobbies, or with things they're interested in, or things that they're studying in science, add those words, and you're not having them read them like flashcards where you go through them. They're going to hold those words. They're going to collect those words. They're going to sort through those words. They're going to say, these are all my science words, and these are all my words that start with S, and these are all my words that have an A in them. And they look at all the different patterns and all the words that they've collected, and that gives them attention to detail and helps them pick those things apart and then put them back together in ways that make sense to them that might not make sense to you. Make words fun, mysterious, and teach the creative power of words. When they have a huge vocabulary of words, they're going to want to be able to read those huge vocabulary of words, and they're going to want to use them. One of the things that we do, we use the dictionary app, and then my daughter just clued me into another one that I can't remember the name of, but we go over words every day as part of our school opening. And we read the definitions of the words and talk about where the word came from, and whether we think it's a dumb word or a good word. Sometimes they come up with words and it's like, nobody has ever used that in a sentence since 1200 BC. And we get a good laugh out of it. And it's fun to collect words. So now we're into the decoding part. And decoding typically means that you start with the beginning sound, and then you move to the middle sound, and then you move to the end sound. And this becomes very confusing to a dyslexic, because they're not seeing the whole picture. They're only seeing the individual sounds. And if they're reading through making those sounds and they don't get it the first time, they're not going to, it becomes an exercise in frustration for them. But instead of teaching them each individual sound, you're going to teach them the whole word. And by teaching them the whole word, then that allows them, again, to be able to see the patterns in it. When learning new words, when they're about to read in a book, a lot of us try to, the typical thing is, well, when you come to a word you don't know, we're going to sound it out. You're not going to do that with a dyslexic child. What you're going to do is say, I'm going to tell you any word you do not know, and we will look at the word, we'll analyze the word, and we'll talk about the word until you understand it. And then we'll read the entire sentence again with you reading that word, and then we move on. You're not giving them, by doing that, you're not setting them up for failure, and you're not making them guess. There's nothing worse than a kid who has failed over and over and over again being told to guess so he gets to be a failure again. And 9 times out of 10, if you ask them to guess, they can't, because they've hit that stress mark and their brain isn't working right anymore. So cut that all out and just help them. If they feel safe reading, then they will be more willing to read. But when every time they read, it is an exercise in frustration because it never works, they get yelled at, they never get it right. It's not fun. Nobody wants to do anything that makes them feel that way. And if we want our kids to learn to read, we have to make it as fun and pleasant as possible. Also, don't have them do this for hours at a time. 10 or 15 minutes every day is all you need to do. You want them to end successfully. You don't want them to end where they are so frustrated that neither one of you can do this anymore. Make it so that they end on a positive note, even if you have to have them redo what they did the day before or 2 weeks ago. Have them end on a positive note. Use colored strips or bookmarks. You can buy fancy little plastic things that are all these different fancy colors. It really doesn't matter what color it is. They used to say that certain colors were better. Now they're saying it really doesn't matter. You use those strips to help them track properly as they read, especially when they start getting into books that have more than one sentence on a page. Part of the problem of dyslexia is that your eyes, like I said, the words can move and the letters can move. And the way to help keep that from happening is to use a colored strip that helps them track properly across the page. Also, if your child is having problems tracking, it might be that the book is too wide. That sounds counterintuitive, but if they have to track so that if they have to track too far when they're first beginning to read back and forth across the page, they may not be able to track. If you find skinnier books that where tracking isn't, they don't actually have to move their head, they just move their eyes to track across it, that may help as well. But try using those bookmarks to help. I'm an adult now, and when I have to learn something and I'm reading, I have to use a bookmark because it helps me track and helps me stay focused on and allows me to absorb the information instead of worrying about what I'm reading. Also, give them extra time to read. Don't say, okay, I want you to read a chapter in this book and you've got 20 minutes to read it. Let them take as long as it needs to, as long as they're reading. Because time, anytime you put a time restriction on it, it just adds stress to what they're trying to do, and they're already stressed from trying to read. Teach them Greek and Latin roots. I think the program we used was English from the Roots Up. I've been using it for years and years and years, and it's good for any child because it teaches not only reading, but also it helps with foreign languages. It helps with all sorts of things by learning, but by breaking the words down instead of into letters, but into roots, then it's the same thing. It's similar to families. And so it allows them another way of tying into the words that they're trying to read. Use flashcards as games and for categorizing words. Don't ever use them for drill. They don't need the drill, number one. If they can make the connection, they have it memorized. But also, it's stress. It's not fun. Let them choose what words they learn. Like I've said before, let them tie whatever it is that their word collection into science and history and favorite hobbies and whatever it is. And if it's slang words, let them learn how to spell slang words. What you're trying to do is create a love of learning, not improve their vocabulary right now. Also, don't limit their level of learning by their level of reading, because they're smart and they know when they're being dumbed down or held back. You don't want to do that, but you can let them read a high interest book something that they're very interested in at a low level of reading, because their interest is there, and you're going, excuse me, what you're trying to do is build fluency by frequency of reading. And if they have a high interest in the book, they're more likely to read it than if you just give them dull books. When I was teaching my older children, there were very few readers on the market that were geared for the amount of reading that my kids had to do in order to get the frequency of reading so that they could get the fluency of reading. And so I started writing stories using all their words that they liked on the chalkboard. I would write it every morning, and we would read it at breakfast. And some of those stories got pretty crazy because of the weird words that they were learning to read. That it became so fun to see what kind of a story Mom was going to come up with the words that they had for the day. And doing those kinds of activities can really help them want to learn to read, because I wouldn't read it to them. I would say, okay, these are all your words. What did I write today? And then they would read it. They would figure it out. Another thing that you can do is have them create their own books. I would sit down and at the computer, and I would type out what they had told me that they wanted in their story, and I would put spaces on the page, and then they would illustrate it, and we would staple it together, and then that would be one of their readers, and they would read them over and over again. They would go take them to different siblings and have them read it. They would take it to their dad and read it to their dad when he came home. Lots of opportunities to interact with words that they know helps them to learn that frequency of learning. Okay, there are some words which are a pain to read. Those are the little words with no images, and they need to be taught separately. And let them create their own picture cards for them. They're words like of, the, at, is. Even as an adult, I will come to the word of sometimes, and I do not have a picture in my mind of what of is. It's not spelled correctly. I mean, it doesn't, the way it's spelled does not make sense with the sounds that it makes. And I will get to it, and I cannot remember what that word is. And it will, or if I have to spell it, it will stop me in my tracks. These words, when you're trying to gain fluency, because they are not, they're, most of the time they're not phonetic, and most of the time they have no real meaning. I mean, what is at? How do you get a picture in your head of at? Let them draw their own pictures that they have in their own head, that when I see this, this is what it means, so that they can get past those little words. Teaching prepositions is another time where they may get stopped in their reading because, again, they can't get pictures in their head of what, so they have no comprehension of what they're reading. Use the entire prepositional phrase when they're reading so that it makes sense, and then let them create pictures. Think of the word over and under, and again, unless you see the whole phrase, it's hard to get a picture in your head. But helping them with those prepositional phrases and odd words like that will be a great help to them. I have another class that I taught a few years ago for reluctant readers. I have actual word lists of what these are, and you can go to that, and it has more information on what they are and how to use them. Now, the next step is to teach fluency, and that is by reading, reading, reading. I remember when I was reading to my now 18-year-old, and he's dyslexic, and we were struggling through our first reading book. We had learned the letters and we were finally to our first book. And so we read through the book. I helped him get through it. And then we talked for a minute, and I said, well, how about if we read it again? Now that you're familiar with it, let's go through and read this book again and see what it was. So I read it through again, and he stopped about halfway through and looked up at me and went, oh, now I get it. I know what books are now. It means the same words are on the page every time. It was such an eye-opener to him that the books that I had been reading and the books he had been trying to read, they were the same. And that the reason that we read books was so that we could reread them, and it would be the same every time. For him as a dyslexic, where the words switched around on him, that was such a novel concept to him that it made us both laugh that he didn't get it until he was like 7 years old. Also, do team reading, and that's where you start out, where I read a sentence, you read a sentence, I read a sentence, you read a sentence, especially when they're moving into chapter books, because it can be intimidating. But if you are helping them, and again, anytime they come across a word that they don't know, you don't make them sound it out, you just tell them what it is and look at the word and let them get comfortable with it. And then you move to, I read a paragraph, you read a paragraph. I read a chapter, I read a page, you read a page. Then I read a chapter, you read a chapter, and pretty soon they're reading the book by themselves. But that helps them become comfortable with reading and helps them get over the fear of getting stuck in the middle of a story and not being able to finish it. For those of you who have the Kindle app, there's an awesome, if you ever use their word runner, it's up in the corner where the 3 dots are. If you click on that, down at the bottom of the list, it says Word Runner. And you choose an easy book that your child knows and understands. And then you put it into Word Runner, and it shows just one word at a time at whatever speed you tell it to. And then you can speed it up over time. And that can really help build fluency, because they're seeing the words one at a time, and they're seeing them as whole words. They do not have time to decode them. And so as they use this for a few minutes every day, this will really help them be able to see words as whole words, and that is the key to fluency, is seeing whole words. It's better to go slow and let them build up their speed than try and push them faster than they need to. If you go if you go online, you can find the reading speeds for typical ages or grades, if that's important to you. But to me, having them read at a word speed is immaterial. They can either read or they can't. They can either read fluently and with comprehension. That's the most important part. As they get older, then you can worry about reading up to speed. But in elementary school, I would not worry about it. Then there's also rereading. Rereading is where you help them with a passage that they are very familiar with. They understand the story, and then they read it at a certain pace over a period of days. I go into more description on how to do this in my Reluctant Readers class. It is a way to help your students really get into, get past the looking at every word. So dyslexic fonts, some people, they work for some people, but not for others, because dyslexia is not an eye problem, it is a brain processing problem. I like open dyslexic font. I use it on, especially on my, when I'm reading ebooks, because if your child is reading and they get headaches, it's because they're over concentrating, and they need, usually it's because they're having problems, they're over focusing because they're having decoding problems. If they get sick to their stomach, or if they get headaches, or their jaw gets too tight, that is a real sign of not getting, or being stuck in the decoding. Dyslexic fonts can help with that a little bit so that you're not over concentrating. I like it because the letters are a little bit further apart in words, and it helps me they don't get all squished together, so it's easier for me to read. It gives me less of a headache when I read. But you know, it's scientific as to whether they work for you or not. I will say that the color, like if you're using an e-reader, that might be helpful for your child to read on, especially if, like for me, using a black screen with white writing makes it much easier for me to read than having it reversed. And so that might help your child until they become fluent, and then they can decide what they're comfortable with, because there's several different screen colors, and you can decide which one does the less eye strain, so that they can focus on reading and not focusing on the way that they're reading. Okay, accommodations for older students. Use audiobooks. Everybody uses audiobooks. There's no sin. Nobody's going to say they didn't learn something because they did an audiobook instead of reading it. Audiobooks can take a lot of stress off of a child, especially an older dyslexic who is still struggling. Like several of my kids didn't read till they were 12 with any kind of fluency. And if I had waited to homeschool them until they were 12, I mean, it would have been silly. But using audiobooks and other, I vote for, if you have a struggling dyslexic, use unit studies to help them so that they can use their smarts to keep them motivated to continue to school and not focus so much on their reading. I have 2 classes that I've taught on unit studies. If you're interested, you can go find those in our audio library. So use video and audio courses. Great courses, has some fantastic classes. Some of them are a bit dry, but there are so many audio and video courses available online right now. I could do a whole class just on that. Grade on context, not on their spelling. Give them quiet time and time to work without distraction. Use visual schedules. Don't have them try and keep all that stuff in their heads. It just uses up brain power. Use pictures if you can, especially for younger kids, of what they're supposed to be doing. Letting the child know what's coming up in a day helps keep the stress off of them, and it doesn't require them to read to be able to do it. They can look at it and see what they need to do. Also using text-to-speech software for writing if it's necessary. That can be a big help. And that is something that Tiffany is going to be talking about. Okay, and here's some resources. Dyslexia.com is a good place, and visualspatial.org are good places to go look for more stuff. And that is the end of my presentation. So now I am open to questions if I can figure out how to get back to.
Okay, if anybody has any questions, they can type them in the chat box or in the Q&A. If not, we'll go ahead and turn our time over to Tiffany. Let's see. Okay, I don't see any questions, so Tiffany, why don't you go ahead and get started?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I feel like I should be on a commercial. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? All right. Dana, I need you to stop sharing your screen. There we go. All righty. Okay, hopefully we are gonna be, can you see my screen? Let's see. There we go. Okay. All right, Dana shared a lot of really great information. So I will try to condense mine as well as I can and still cover kind of the basics. There's a lot of overlap between dyslexia and dysgraphia, but it's not exactly the same. And she talked a lot about some things that we'll be able to cover really quickly because she did such a good job of covering them. But just to give you an idea of how I started this journey of learning about dysgraphia, I had never heard of it before, and really it would have never occurred to me that the problems I was having teaching my daughter were as a result of something going on in the brain, because I really honestly just thought she was lazy. And it was really frustrating her, and it was frustrating me, and a lot of prayers were offered, you know, Heavenly Father, help me. It's really important that my daughter knows how to work well, how to work hard, how to work well. Help me teach her not to be lazy, were basically my prayer. And my daughter does martial arts, and we went to her first martial arts tournament. And I don't know if you've ever been to a tournament like this, but it's somewhat like a swim meet or a track meet where you're there almost all day for maybe at the tops, depending on how many events they're entered in, 10 minutes of your child actually doing something. So I had a lot of time to kill at this martial arts tournament, and I had a homeschooling magazine with me. And I read that thing cover to cover. I've never paid so close attention to the ads and everything because I was so bored waiting for my daughter to do her thing. And there was an article on dysgraphia. And frankly, I probably would have skipped that article had I have not been so bored and wanted something to read. So the beginning of the article listed about 11 symptoms of or signs of dysgraphia. And my daughter hit the check mark on like 9 or 10 of the 11. And I was just floored. I thought, oh my goodness, I need to repent. I need to fix my attitude thinking my daughter was lazy when she's really got a lot more going on than that. So that's how I started my journey. Dysgraphia is not as well researched as dyslexia. There's a lot of misunderstanding. A lot of people just think it's sloppy handwriting, or something that can be fixed easily, like with a pencil grip or something. And there's really a lot more going on in the brain than that. And we'll get through that. But if I were teaching this class live, what I had planned to do is pass out paper and a pen for everybody. And I was gonna ask you to write an essay, or not really an essay, a paragraph, using your non-dominant hand. So in other words, if you're right-handed, I was gonna ask you to use your left hand. And if you were left-handed, I was going to ask you to use your right hand, and your topic is what I did during quarantine. And I was going to set a timer for 2 minutes and say, okay, go. And see how much you could get written out in this 2-minute time period with your non-dominant hand. And I think most of you would find it's really frustrating and really hard to do that. And that is what your dysgraphic kid is facing every single day. Okay, here are some of the signs and symptoms, and some of these really at the time initially seemed really unrelated. How can having a hard time tying shoes tie in with handwriting, right? Trouble lining up the math problems. This becomes really a huge challenge when they start doing like double-digit multiplication or double-digit division. They just can't seem to understand the places and the spaces and where that goes. They have excessive trouble with spelling, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit. They mix both capital and lowercase letters when they write. Now, for about the first 6 months, a child learns how to write, usually in kindergarten. That's really common. But once they get beyond that point, if they're using capital and lowercase indiscriminately, like in the middle of the word, there'll be a random capital letter. That's usually a sign that there's more going on in the brain than you realize. Messy handwriting is certainly one of the symptoms, but I've got to tell you, my daughter does not have awful handwriting. In fact, her handwriting is probably about as good as mine, which doesn't say much. I have doctor handwriting, but don't go just on messy handwriting alone. They misuse or forget their punctuation. You know, they know you've taught them, you've spent a lot of time on periods. They know exclamation points. They can sing the grammar rock songs to you from the early 80s. And so they know this, but they just can't get it into practice. Poor spatial, or have difficulty getting words on paper. If they talk to you and tell you a story, man, they've got great stories, but getting that down, you know, all of a sudden they condense it down to the fewest number of words possible, and you get a story that says she ran, where, you know, she'd taken 5 minutes to tell you something before that. Poor spatial planning. My daughter could never, in workbooks, she could never make those words fit on the little lines, and she would always complain, why are these spaces so little? She just couldn't get the words to fit right. And an awkward or a painful pencil grip can be a sign, but it's not necessarily, and it's not in and of itself a sign of dysgraphia. Trouble with scissors, buttons, zippers, or other small items, and huge trouble with place value or reading an analog clock. My daughter was zooming along in math until we hit place value, and then it was like Mount Vesuvius erupted and she had a total like meltdown, and I was like, what in the world? Well, now I know that that's a challenge with dysgraphia, and reading a clock, a regular clock, you know, with the hands is also really challenging. So I want to look at just really quickly what's going on in the brain. Oh, actually, I guess we're going to wait just a second. Dana spent a lot of time on this, so I'm not going to labor it, but if you Google famous people with dyslexia, you can get a list of thousands of people. It's been much better studied. When you check for people with dysgraphia, as you can see, the list is a lot shorter, but pretty impressive. Albert Einstein was actually kicked out of school because his teachers thought he was so stupid. He didn't read or write well, and so he was one of the early homeschoolers because his mother knew better. His mother knew he was very bright. Thomas Edison is another one that probably was more dyslexic than dysgraphic, but he was also, they tried to put him in special ed classes. And he showed us all, didn't he? And Agatha Christie has written more than 75 novels, and yet she struggles with dysgraphia. So it really can be a blessing. These kids tend to think in pictures, as Dana said, rather than anything else. They could be super creative. They are really talented artistically. And they really have so many things. This can be such a blessing if you can focus on the strengths and not the challenges. Now the challenges are there. And the good news about brain research and all of this is that the brain is much more what they call plastic than we initially thought. We really thought that you had a small window of opportunity to help people form new neural pathways, and if you got to them too late or they were too old, you were out of luck. But that is not the case. They found that our brains can learn new things all throughout our life. And so really we want to focus on the strengths and help our kids capitalize on their strengths. Okay. I want to just mention Angela Lee Duckworth has done a fabulous TED Talk on grit. It was in 2013. And this is something that I recommend you listen to, even if you're not struggling, but especially your kids. And learning that it's not native intelligence that helps you. It's grit. It's not giving up when things are hard. It is going back again and again and again and working on something. And that is one of the biggest predictors of success. So I tell my daughter all the time that even though she is struggling with this, I just help her see that the grit she is forming is going to be a huge blessing in her life. And, you know, this may be the best way to teach it to her. It may not. I wouldn't have picked this for her, but I can tell you that she is learning to be much more persistent than she would be if she were as gifted as she is, but didn't have these challenges. So I really highly recommend that TED Talk. Okay, this is what's going on in your brain. Dana talked a little bit about the left and the right hemispheres, and right down the center is the corpus callosum. And your left brain does things like thinking and concentration, your short-term memory. And your right brain is in doing things and when things become automatic and you don't have to think about it, and that's where your long-term memory is. So I use an analogy of driving a car. When you're first in driver's ed, there are so many things to think about, right? You've got to check your mirrors, you've got to know where you are in your lane, you've got to steer, you've got to remember which one is the brake and which one is the gas and when you should apply it and which foot to use and your turn signals and your windshield wipers, and it's overwhelming the amount of new tasks and new things that your brain has to process when you're first driving. Okay, so it's really hard and it can be really exhausting, right? But then after you drive for a while, it becomes more automatic. And the longer you drive and the more you do it, it is more automatic. And in fact, at some point you get to the point where you're like drinking a soda or eating your hamburger or fiddling with the radio, or you shouldn't be texting, but we know people do it. You know, that is because things have crossed over that corpus callosum and have become automatic. You don't have to think about it. It's not so hard. But for someone who has dysgraphia, that does not cross over automatically. So every time they go to write, it is like they are back in kindergarten learning how to form those letters. So when you write, there's a lot of things going on, right? You need to remember how to form the letters. You need to figure out the spacing on the line. You need to think of the content that you were going to write. You need to remember your grammar rules, right? You need to do your punctuation. You need to try to make it interesting and use adverbs and adjectives. And there's a lot going on. And when you're struggling to get that letter written, like when you're struggling to write an A, your train gets derailed long before you can even think of punctuation and spelling. So that's what's happening, is that every time your kid sits down to write, it is exhausting. Okay, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just wanted to show you that the areas of the brain that fire up in good writers versus poor writers are very different. You can see that it's different. So they're using different processing paths. A lot of dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia are often found together. And there's also a higher linkage with ADHD. So if you've got kids with any of those others, you may be dealing with some dysgraphia as well. Okay, I love this idea. Dr. Mel Levine talks about your energy level is like a battery, right? And that's finite. You have what you have. And things like good nutrition and sleep can certainly help you feel at your best or a good health. But at some point, your energy for the day is the energy you have for that day. And when you have a learning challenge or a learning glitch or a block learning gate, it's like your energy leaks out of your battery. And something that takes neurotypical kids maybe like 2 or 3% of their battery might take your kid who's having some challenges like 80 or 90% of the battery. So that's when you start getting some bad behaviors like meltdowns, headaches, physical, like feeling sick or just wiped out, really emotional, crying, I can't do this. It's because the practice of writing is so draining that it leaves very little. It has discharged your battery to a really low level. So does that mean we don't have our kids write? No, that's not what it means. It's not at all what it means. In fact, we've got to help them just manage their energy level a little bit better. Okay, so this is what they used to say, right? This was gonna, if you used a specialized pencil grip, this was gonna solve everything. And that used to really frustrate me. I can't tell you how many times I sat through an online video or read some articles, or, you know, in my research, I came across this, and it's really frustrating. And know that if your child does feel uncomfortable or it's painful to grasp a pencil or a pen, a grip can really help. But it's not going to solve what's going on neurologically in the brain. If your child is having their hand hurts a lot, I would take them to like Lakeshore Learning or a teacher supply store where they have all kinds of different pencil grips. You can see some of them are really unique, some of them are a little more pedestrian, and have your kid try them. It won't hurt, but it's not going to solve everything. Okay, so there are two kind of parts to the strategy. The first one is to let's mitigate the energy leak as much as we can, right? Let's help them be successful in their other areas. And then let's long-term, let's look how we're going to form these neural pathways. So we're going to focus on, for a few minutes, on the short term, like how are we going to mitigate this? How are we going to make school pleasant for everyone? Okay. This is really, it differs by the kid. Some of them find that it's much easier to type rather than to physically write. So they'll do their papers on a computer rather than written. Some kids, it's not any easier. It's the same amount of effort, but it's certainly worth trying to let your child, even young, type rather than write things. There are a lot of good free typing apps or free online typing programs. So just find one and have your kids do it. That'll help a lot if they feel more comfortable typing. Okay. And this varies by the child too, but some kids do much better writing in cursive rather than print. And that's because when you start a word, you don't stop until the end of the word. So it's much more flowy. So fewer decisions to make, things kind of flow more smoothly, they connect together. I did teach my daughter cursive. I don't know if it helped her. She didn't really feel like it did, but a lot of kids seem to do much better with cursive. I recommend Handwriting Without Tears, their cursive. If you want to try that, you really can start trying cursive as early as 2nd or 3rd grade. So if your kid is struggling, try cursive. It's worth a shot. I don't have my daughter write things in workbooks. I don't often test, but if I do test, I have her tell me. I do it verbally or orally. And we used to do, for history, we didn't really use the tests as tests, but we'd use them to kind of revisit what we had just learned, right? And so we would talk about the information that we had read together or whatever I had presented. I would ask her the question, and then she would give me the answer, and I would write it down for her. I felt like I needed some kind of written record of the things we had covered, and so I was her scribe. And that was fine to me because the writing wasn't integral to the learning. And by the way, with dysgraphics, I know the research is coming out that note-taking really helps transfer information into long-term memory, but for dysgraphics, it does not, which is one of the reasons why spelling is so hard, because the traditional method of teaching spelling, right, is to write the word like 3 or 4 times until it transfers over into that longer-term memory. It will never transfer for a dysgraphic student that you haven't been working with on some long-term strategies. So just know that dysgraphics don't learn by taking notes, and they're not going to learn their spelling words by writing them a million times. So don't torture your kid, don't torture yourself. Use a multi-sensory approach to teaching, and this really is any kid can benefit from doing active projects. Building dioramas, when you're studying the Vikings, building boats, making recipes, anything you can do to tie in the other senses, creating videos, acting out plays, doing reading, choral reading or anything you can do to bring in the other senses is going to really help. It'll make it more interesting for your kid, and it'll make it more interesting for you, frankly. Okay. Speech to text software. Now, I am more neurotypical, and that stuff drives me crazy because I look down and see all the misspellings and the errors, and I almost can't think looking at it, but my daughter loves it. And it really, to get her ideas down quickly, it helps a lot. And if she's going to make a list of any kind, she uses that almost exclusively. And when I do give her writing assignments, a lot of times we'll talk it through. She'll say it out loud. She'll speak it first, and then she'll put it on paper. It's getting it out, describing it helps a lot. For math, or even just to help with the visual spatial aspect of it, if they use graph paper or line paper that they turn sideways to do their math problems, that helps them line up the problems much better. And then for spelling in particular, we spend a lot of time doing fun things like writing her spelling words into sand or shaving cream, using her fingers instead of like a pen or a pencil. And she really liked that. It was a little more messy. We also did things with Play-Doh, spelled out words with Play-Doh or magnetic letter tiles, you know, that go on the fridge. She really liked those, and those helped. And a lot of times we would do spelling lists just orally, because if she could look at a word and kind of use that photographic memory, she could remember it and she could repeat it. So we did a lot of things out loud. Okay, now here's where we're going to get into a lot of the long-term stuff, because you can form those neural pathways. And I've taken a lot of my information from a woman, I'll show you her stuff in just a minute, but her name is Diane Kraft. And I don't have any affiliation with her company. I don't get any kickbacks or anything, although it'd be great if I did, but I recommend her stuff because it is that good. And it's really that useful, and it's very reasonably priced. Things that exercises or activities that cross the midline, right? That corpus callosum down the middle of your body will help actually form new neural connections. So we didn't know it, but my daughter's martial arts is really good for her because she has to punch on one side and punch on the other side. She has to kick with her right foot and kick with her left foot. When she is doing her forms or her patterns, she does it on one side, and then she has to, on a higher belt, they do the same thing on a different side. So they're learning and they're crossing the midline, and it's crazy good for them. Other good exercises are windmills or jumping jacks, mountain climbers, planks, crab walking. Shooting baskets is also really good as long as they're switching hands, or dribbling, right? So if they're dribbling with their left hand and then they need to switch it to their right, and then they need to shoot with their right and shoot with their left. So do anything that crosses that midline, and crossing monkey bars, really good for them as well. So those are physical things, right? That you can do that you wouldn't necessarily think of them as school, but you can tie in to doing windmills while reciting spelling words, or jumping jacks while they're learning sight words, or like integrate the physical activities with what you're trying to teach them and what they are learning. Okay, this is the stuff I was telling you about, the Diane Kraft stuff. She has them do figure eights and sit down at the table, and this takes full parental involvement. There is no assigning this to your kid and walking off, unfortunately. But you do these figure eights, and it really helps form those neural pathways. The DVD I first got was Diane Kraft's Smart Kids Who Hate to Write. And she's got some right brain learning strategy. She's got a whole bunch of stuff on her website. And at the end of this, I've got her website URL for you. She's got a lot of really amazing things, and is well worth your time and money. There are also a lot of private tutors or people that work with students who have dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, and there may be some really legitimate reasons to go see them and pay that money to have a private tutor do it. Maybe salvage your relationship with your child or have some outside accountability. But really, if there's a lot you can do, and you don't need to spend that money. And Diane Craft website will show you a whole range of stuff that is really great. Okay, this is something that she shares with for pre-writing, because these kids think in pictures. We want to give them, we want to break the writing process down into as small chunks as we can and give them visual pictures to hang their information on. It makes it so much easier. So for example, if I gave my daughter a writing assignment, we would break it up into 3 chunks, like 3 components. And I'll show you how that looks for something she did about a year or so ago. The dogs make good pets, right? She really wanted a dog. And so we told her she had to write us something to convince us that dogs were gonna be a good pet. So she broke down to dogs help with loneliness, dogs can make you laugh, and dogs guard your house. And then under each one of these categories, she had to come up with 3 kind of points to substantiate her arguments. And then I had her add these transition words in, firstly, secondly, and finally. And then to tie it all together in a summarizing paragraph. And once she could fill this out, it was much easier for her to write because she could see it visually, right? And she was no longer struggling to figure out the content of what she should write about. So this has really worked for her. Another thing that's worked for her really well, it's not quite as graphically organized, but Institute of Excellence in Writing, or IEW, does a really nice job. And my daughter hated the program, but she did excellent writing. So I think, I don't know what kind of an endorsement that is, but she did really well with it. And what they do is they give you a paragraph that the student reads. They ask them to summarize 3 words for each sentence to help them kind of remember the content. And then they take those notes, just the 3 words for each sentence, and they rewrite the paragraph in their own words using those ideas, right? So they don't have to come up with what to write. They can focus more on the mechanics of writing. And she did so well with that, in fact, that I was teaching at a local co-op, an IEW class, and I could not find my original materials. We moved not too long ago and I couldn't find them, but my daughter's paragraphs were well written enough that I could use her paragraphs as the source paragraphs to teach from. So that might be worth your investment as well. And that is not cheap, but to me, it was totally worth it. Okay. But I want to say this, and this really is about all kids, all writers, all beginning writers. Focus more on the progress, not the product. It is so disheartening to work so hard to turn something out and then have somebody go through it with a red pen and point out all their mistakes. And it's just so deflating. Not too long ago, as an adult, I've been learning some new things, some new technologies, and I was really struggling with them. They were really hard for me, but I felt like I was doing it, and I was really kind of feeling a sense of satisfaction. Look at this progress, look at what I can do. And then I got an email of somebody being really critical that I wasn't doing things right like I thought I was. And it just, I was, as an adult who has much better coping skills, I felt really deflated. I cried, I was angry, I wanted to quit. I said, I'm never gonna do this again. Like, so as an adult, I had those feelings. So you can imagine your kids as they're learning how disheartening it must be to get something, you know, that you worked so hard on and to not have it be right. So focus on what is right. Because I like colorful pens, I pick a pink or a purple or a green or a blue, And I go through when she's written something and I find everything that's right with it. And at first it was hard to find things that were right. So if she ever started a sentence with a capital letter, boy, she got a point written right there in the colorful pen right by it. And if she used correct punctuation, if she remembered a comma, if she inserted an adverb or an adjective, I didn't even care if they weren't spelled right. I overlooked anything that was wrong and focused on the right, the positive. And when I gave that back to her, I was like, look, you remembered here and here and here to use capital letters, you got punctuation right, and here's an adjective you used, great job. This is, I know you worked really hard on this. This is, you're really improving. And as you work on it and as you give them the writing assignments and as they improve, then celebrate those successes. By golly, there should be a trip to the ice cream parlor, right? Or my daughter loves Korean pop music, so she can earn these little K-pop cards when she does a great job, or could be Pokemon or a trip to the store with mom, or whatever is a reward. Celebrate the success, focus on the progress, and help them feel good, because nobody wants to do something they're bad at. Nobody wants to struggle, but as they struggle, they're forming new neural pathways and they're really helping themselves improve. And if you save some of their early writing and show it to them later, boy, they can see such an improvement, and that is a feeling of success. And that's really what we want to leave our kids with, is a feeling of success, that they are overcoming their challenges, and they may not, or it may take them longer to do things, break assignments down into small chunks, but celebrate their successes all the time. Okay, and here's some additional resources. I really focused on the things I thought were helpful. There's a lot of YouTube videos out there that really have a lot of misinformation, or aren't really complete, or they don't really give you anything practical that can be helpful. Like I mentioned, dianecraft.org was my favorite resource by far. She does some great stuff. And Handwriting Without Tears, I can't recommend it high enough. Anyway, I am ready if there are any questions.
Anybody have any questions for Tiffany? Oh, we got to. Okay. It doesn't look like we have any questions. So we thank you all for coming. Remind you that you can view these again later on our YouTube channel or on Facebook. Also in our audio library, they'll be posted. And we'll see you again next week for classes at 11 and 6 Eastern time. Thank you so much.